and record. Cool. All right, let me present and we will go ahead and get started. So today is going to be a mixture of kind of a lecture / interactive discussion. We have some open discussion questions based on the features that we came up with yesterday. And then we'll also hop into a Miro board, and the outcome will basically be understanding if any of our MVP features have any dependencies on one another and figuring out if we need to work on sequencing. So we won't cover all of these today. So we'll cover 1 through 3, and then we'll save backlogs and user stories and user story mapping for next week. This is once you get into Agile, it's hard to talk about certain things without addressing others. So our approach will be just like breaking this up the best that we can. And we'll end today having a better understanding of how to estimate, and we'll be t-shirt sizing our features using whichever method and framework of sizing that we decide. So to start, we'll talk about Agile and just give an overview of Agile, because right now our world has kind of been focused on a lot of design thinking and lean. And as we trend closer to development, we'll start picking up these Agile principles, which have a lot of parallels with lean and with design thinking. We'll also talk about epics and features. And then, like I said before, we'll end with a discussion on estimations, velocity, and how we want to size different things. So to kick us off, what is Agile? So Agile, I'm sure you all have heard. Did anybody have anything before I start? Okay, cool. I thought I heard something. All right. So Agile is a term that a lot of you have probably heard. So it's basically a workflow, and it's a framework of working that helps you break down your project or your product into iterations or sprints and incorporate user feedback faster into your cycle. So it's a way to help promote visibility, because you're having shorter planning cycles and you're constantly validating, releasing, and getting feedback and incorporating it. So it's really a way to build a value-based process and help meet your user or your customers' requests and demand a bit faster. So there are some defining guidelines of Agile. A lot of these are very kind of businessy, so I'll try to frame this in the context of wavelength. So individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So we don't want to get bogged down in having like a ton of different processes or like 15 different tools for doing things. We'd rather just like have a quick conversation or an interaction with somebody versus having to like defer to tools all the time. Like, oh, go look at, this tool to get this answer. It's really valuing face-to-face interaction and communication. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So a lot of times when you think of like a regular business, they have the mindset of like, how can I re-up this contract with my customer? How can I get more business from this customer? Whereas when looking at Agile, we're preferring like, how can we collaborate with the customer? How can we talk to our users to understand what would be most valuable for them versus just trying to get more money out of them or squeeze a deal for a contract. Working software over comprehensive documentation. So what this means is basically like, we won't delay like a release or getting working software out the door just because everything isn't documented A to Z. There are going to be lots of edge cases that we have. There's going to be lots of different things that we could document, but we're going to prioritize getting working demoable software out the door so we can get feedback versus documenting every single script or edge case that we could possibly do that would potentially delay our release in getting this into the hands of the customer. And then lastly, responding to change over following a plan. So this shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Like, we're working in the lean mindset where, it's those quick, small iterations where we're getting feedback. And instead of, the trend line where we're not releasing and we're building risk, we're reducing risk by knowing that there's going to be change, and we're anticipating that change by getting feedback from our customers or our users. All right. Moving on. So the 12 principles of Agile, we can go through these pretty quickly because none of them should be super surprising. It focuses on customer value, customer satisfaction. So how can we make our users happy? We know that requirements will change. So let's have that, be baked into our process and have meetings maybe once a week where we're talking about our requirements, and iteration planning meetings where we're anticipating these changing requirements. Frequent delivery, so releasing quickly. Communicating regularly, so we already do that. Stand ups, stand downs, having a Slack channel. Supporting our team members. So if somebody needs help, we're more than happy to jump in and offer our input and help speed them along. Face-to-face communication. I think we're pretty good at that. So there's two here on measuring work progress and measuring progress. So measuring work progress is having a way to size our requirements. So we're pointing our stories, and then at the end of each iteration, we're seeing how much did we accomplish and seeing how that trends over time. Whereas measuring progress is more like looking at our product. How are our metrics for our product performing? So one's more team focused, one's more product focused. There's a development process. So we have pipelines, we can build in, ideally less than 10 minutes, and that process is up and running and in place. Good design. So thankfully we have a good designer. So that means we'll have good design. So we have Chris on our team. So we value good design because we value customer satisfaction. We always continue seeking results. So we're metrics driven, we are outcome driven, and we reflect and adjust regularly. So a lot of these things we're already doing, especially with that, we're doing a retro every week and we're reflecting and adjusting as needed. Are there any questions on these Agile principles? Ruby. Moving on. So we've been working mostly lean so far because that's one way, but there are multiple frameworks that we're using, and lean is just one of them. Design thinking is another. We have the EXP process that we're also learning to incorporate into our software lifecycle, and there's Agile too. So how are Agile, or how does it fit into our software development process? So when we think about lean is all about eliminating waste. How can we move fast and learn the most by doing the least amount of effort? Whereas Agile is similar, but it's more focused on cross collaboration. We're incorporating our feedback from our stakeholders, from our developers, our end users. When we have meetings with our team, usually there's a representative from product, from design, from tech. It's all about collaborating so that we can all be involved in the planning process. So using these processes from Agile and from Lean is really where we'll deliver the most value to our customers, because we're releasing in a certain framework, and we're also reducing our risk and learning as much as we can. So we're doing a lot of these already, but wanted to touch on a lot of the ceremonies that are involved in Agile software development. So, and some of these are also not just ceremonies, but they're pieces of work or items of work that we'll have and we'll keep updated throughout our software development lifecycle. So we'll have a product backlog. It will have a prioritized list of user stories. The good thing is we're not going to try to get too far ahead. So that's great news for Dane, because he doesn't have to work months and months ahead. We want to stay like a sprint or two ahead of our user stories. But we know, because we're anticipating change, that we don't want to get too far ahead, because if we're writing user stories for 3 months from now, that's not really acting in the principle of anticipating change. So we want to have like a decent runway of user stories and a decent runway of the backlog, but no more than 2 to 3 sprints out. We'll do sprint planning or iteration planning typically every week or 2 weeks, depending on the cycle that we agree upon. And we'll pull those stories into a sprint backlog. So those are kind of what we agree we think we can accomplish, but it's not necessarily a commitment for that specific iteration. And then we're doing daily stand-ups. So we're checking in on the progress, identifying blockers. We're doing sprint reviews. So at the end of the sprint, like, what did we think we accomplished and why do we think we got there? And we're also basically releasing at the end of each iteration. So the idea is that at the end of each iteration, we're able to release some type of value to the customer. Any questions on these ceremonies or work items? All right, so that's kind of a high level overview of Agile. We'll dive in a little bit more specifically into a lot of these like iteration and sprint plannings and pre-iteration meetings once we get into the user story writing phase. So that will happen in the next kind of like 2-ish weeks. But just keeping it high level for now. And then once we start really like getting into the software development lifecycle, we'll start diving into each of those ceremonies a bit further. So moving on to epics and features. So this is the hot topic right now, because we were able to define our MVP last week, and we had this conversation of like, what features do we want to include in our MVP and which are not in scope for now. So it's important to understand what an epic versus a feature versus a user story is, because a lot of these terms are tossed out. And the funny thing is that it really depends on what organization you're at and what backlog management tool you use, which will dictate how you use them moving forward. So I'll touch on that here in a second. But from a high level, an epic is typically a large initiative. So it might be like a new product, a solution, or services to a user. And typically it can span over more than one release. Whereas features themselves are smaller items of work that will provide value to a user and typically contain a collection of user stories. And typically features will fit into a specific release. And then the lowest level that we'll touch on is the user story, which represents a user's singular need and is typically a planning item. So this fits into one iteration and is implemented by a series of tasks that the engineers will task out once they pull a story in for an iteration. So what I mentioned earlier about this being different at different companies, there can be instances where you might only have epics and stories. For instance, I used Azure DevOps as a planning tool at one of my previous jobs, and it would physically not let you tie stories to features. You could only tie stories to epics. However, at some companies, you'll use epics, features, and stories. So it really depends. What I think the most important thing to note here is that stories will always be the planning items you pull into the sprint, and the features and epics are just the higher level buckets of work that provide value to a user. So for our purposes moving forward, I'll mention, when I mention our work items that we're going to discuss later today, I will refer to them, that's the word I was looking for, as features. So we'll talk about them as features. We'll be t-shirt sizing the features. Any questions on this? Cool.
This might be a dumb question, but by t-shirt sizing, you just mean like how difficult it will be, how important it will be, or kind of like the intersection of those two to figure out what we should tackle first?
That's a good question, Ian. It will be more so what we think the effort is. So t-shirt sizing won't talk about priority. It's just like, and we have like a full section on this later in this discussion, but it basically from a high level is like, broadly speaking, what is the level of effort to complete this body of work? And t-shirt size is typically more broad and less specific than like a story point. So a story point actually gives it like a value, whereas t-shirt size is like, like we don't know all the details of this feature yet. We know it's going to do a couple things. And so like we generally have an estimate that this will be small, medium, large, or extra large.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, so what is an epic? An epic is a large body of work that can be broken down into a smaller number of user stories. And they're typically the end goal made up of multiple modules or features. So an epic can fit into our process as part of the product roadmap. So the product roadmap will basically be now, near, future, and the set of outcomes. And then the epics are basically how we're going to get to that outcome. Similar to the features as well. So we can have features here substituted as the ways that will reach our outcome. So a set of completed epics or features drive to a specific initiative, which keeps the overall product developing and evolving with our users' needs. So basically, it's a way that we can plan improvements to our users' workflows that will basically help us achieve our outcomes. And I wanted to walk us through an example here. So this is an example where we're working with a space launch. So think large here. So let's say it's 2050 and we work for a recreational space travel organization, so SpaceX or something. And we do about a dozen launches a year. So each launch isn't the biggest thing we do in the year, but it's not a routine thing that we do, and we'll have to have a lot of man hours needed to complete this. So that's pretty much a good size for an epic. So say we have a launch in March 2050. And there's going to be some teams that are working on this specific launch, and we need stories to improve key aspects of this shuttle launch things like customers buying the tickets to actually launching the rocket itself. So, there's going to be some different product teams involved, like the team that oversees the customer ticket portal, or the team that actually will help propel the rocket to launch. So one epic would be this 2050 launch, and the software team supporting actual ticket purchasing will have their own set of stories towards this epic. And the propulsion team might have their own set of stories that are a little bit more technical, focused on actually getting the rocket up and running. So an epic could have multiple product teams working on this. All right, pivoting a little bit, let's jump into estimations and velocity. And don't worry, we're not going through all 51 slides. We have like maybe 10, 15 more, and we'll pick the rest of them back up. So we're talking now about effort estimation. So the outcome of this part of the discussion is we'll end up t-shirt sizing those epics that we have. So effort estimation are usually, but not always, in the case of t-shirt sizing, numerical point values that represent a relative effort required from a development team to complete a user story or feature. And I'll come back to this word relative because it's really important that we keep that in mind when we're doing effort estimation. So some important notes on estimating, it's on a team by team point scale. So our team's estimates are not going to be the same as the other team that doesn't exist today, their estimates when they come in and they start engineering. Our estimates are unique to our individual team. And if we have one new person that joins the team or one other person that leaves, like our estimates might change, so that they're very fluid and we need to be receptive to that. And we are not going to go further back than like the previous 3 iterations when we're looking at our velocity when planning, because we know that things change and we need to be fluid. The one other important part is that we need to come to a consensus when doing pointing and estimations. So if one person dissents or has a different opinion, we'll have to discuss it until we all come to a consensus and agree on a story or a feature's value. When I say relative, it represents the story's complexity in comparison to other stories in the backlog. So we'll want to have like one anchoring story, like this is like a 1. And we all know what this story is a 1. It's fixing a widget. And then we'll point all of our other stories in comparison. Okay, we know that this is a 1. Does this equal more effort or less effort than this story point that's a 1? So we'll always be anchoring to one individual work item, and then we'll get a better idea of like, relatively speaking, is this story larger or smaller than our other stories? And they help us forecast future product releases. It's important that we note that it's not a commitment, but it's just a forecasting tool. So why do we estimate? Give clarity on the development timeframe. So we'll have a better idea of, if it's going to happen this quarter or next quarter, or when we can expect a feature to be done. And it helps to coordinate with the stakeholders. It's important because we want to know when we release a product, a huge part of releasing a product is being able to go to market and tell your users, hey, we've done a thing. And having estimations helps to coordinate, in a corporation, they'll have product marketing managers or people that work in customer success that will help work with our customers to say, hey, we have these new features available. So having some type of estimate will help them to understand what their timeline will be to start working on those things. Helps to align for needed capacity. So if we see that, oh shoot, we have 10 features and we only have 3 engineers to work on these 10 features, that's a good business case to go back to our stakeholders and say, hey, we need help. We need 5 more engineers working on this, or we need to split into 2 product teams to speed up work. And it helps non-developers understand the effort involved. So for us non-technical folk, we might think that something's super easy, but if you engineers say, no, this is a 13, we'll have that conversation. So estimating will spark that conversation to understand why something is so big or so small.
Okay. Sorry, I have another question for the people who worked at Kessel Run. Did you guys have to do STIGs? Are you familiar with that?
No, I don't know what that is.
Nick, you don't either?
So they did, but it was abstracted a bit. We worked with the testing squadron to basically answer them. But in short, yes, those were taken into consideration.
Yeah. to be like fully in compliance with like DISA NIST, the DISA makes these things called STIGs, which are secure technical implementation guides, and they dictate like if you're going to use Apache web server, you have to all these settings sort of set a certain way. So at the 483rd, they're like in the process of forcing everybody to fully comply with all the STIGs, but I don't know what, you know, apparently Kessel Run does do the STIGs. So for a new app, we would have to answer all of those questions, like how are we storing our private keys? Are they encrypted? Blah, 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 blah. And so the number of STIGs that we have to comply with depends on the technologies that we use. So there's like a database STIG, a web server STIG, and then there's like specific web server STIGs. So Apache Tomcat has its own STIG. And then
so they automated this like a little bit using a thing called SD elements, which basically just dumps a whole lot of like chores in your backlog, for lack of a better term, which is just like based on this technology stack. To like what you were just saying is you have to like answer those questions, and those questions go into like your official documentation on you being released and authorized to work in the environment in which you were trying to.
Yeah. STIGs are not something STIGs are more about like when you install something in production, like part of like inspections that happen and stuff like that. Like, this
was like the agreement that like KR had with the program office that would be checking those things.
Right. So as part of our like tasks to get the app running, it would be, you know, complying. I mean, it sounds like maybe it's a little bit nicer at Kessel Run if we use their STIG process. But if we don't use their STIG process, then we just have to like do it ourselves.
Okay. Yeah, I think because we're using their tech stack, I combine those two words, as well, and we're using linear, it sounds like what Nick is saying is that they had like automated chores, so that could make it easier for us, at least. Like we'll have those automated chores show up on our backlog that we'll need to do. But that's a really good call out, Austin.
Yeah, and I want to point out that like we are in discussion with where we will put this. It might run on Kessel Run and it might not. So making assumptions based on, oh, Kessel Run handles that for us.
Yep.
Is not necessarily what we want.
Yeah.
Are we talking about using a different option?
Yes.
Regardless of the option that you're going to use, like this is a requirement for you guys to operate on a government network. So this is going to be things that you will eventually do. It doesn't necessarily, the format of it will likely change. Pipeline to pipeline, dev environment to production environment.
Cool. So just a good thing to note as a requirement for our production release. Okay. All right. Going back to this topic. So estimating does not give us a certain deadline. I want to make that really clear. We don't want to use estimates to forecast and commit to a deadline. It just helps us give a general idea, and it can change as teams find out that a ticket is more or less complex than we first thought. So, you know, we're always learning. We need to anticipate change. And when things change with requirements and with our user stories, then we'll have to revisit those estimations that we originally gave. So we'll typically use a scale. Like I said, this is all relative. So scales are good at helping us compare sizes. So estimating a story on a scale helps to give more clarity to its complexity and relative sizing in terms of development. So we always want to be thinking of scales. And for this one, we're using a Fibonacci scale, which I think is probably the industry standard for estimating within Agile. And we don't necessarily want to go up by equal increments, because there are certain things that you need to think about when jumping from a 5 to an 8 that makes something turn from a car into a bus. So by doing this on some type of scale that's not necessarily pushing up point by point or in equal increments, it helps us make decisions faster and think in terms of relative sizing.
So your train, it doesn't add up. 8 plus 13 is 21, not 20. And then after that is messed up.
Yeah, that is. So they're actually not using Fibonacci. They're using their own scale. That's a good call. I actually didn't think about that. Because we've done 21s before. So you have a good eye, Austin. I'm gonna go burn that image after this.
Best at math than I am.
Okay, cool. Let's go through a couple of examples. So we have 3 different user stories here. We have one that says, and these aren't titled as user stories, but think about these as like work to do. So the first work to do is adding a widget that allows users to upload a profile picture. The second one is integrating with a cutting edge third-party software for sending text messages to new subscribers. And then the last is changing text copy on the application homepage from files to resource files. All right, relatively speaking, what do we think is the smallest body of work here? Between the 3?
Changing the text.
Cool. Everybody agree?
Yes.
What do we think is the biggest body of work here?
Probably the third-party software, but it'd be something you'd have to look at the software too, but my gut feeling would be that one.
Yep.
Yeah, middle one.
Yeah. Yep. So if we think about it, actually, I might have, I guess we could actually talk about this. So 1 or 5, actually, I think these actually are supposed to be 5 and 1. So let me fix that really quick. 5 and 1. All right.
It just makes us feel smart by changing the answers while we answer them wrong.
No, you're fine. You guys are right.
Six
So
what? It looks fine to me.
the text copy here, so the text copy is like a very simple thing. So you're going in, you're changing text copy, and that is definitely like the anchoring of just like a simple, straightforward story. A widget could be something in the middle. We have to know more about like what that widget is. It's an upload icon, an upload
Yeah.
picture, and then we're talking about integrating with a cutting edge third-party software. So that's like a 13. So if we're thinking about integrating with Twilio, I worked with Twilio at my last job. It was a text message subscription. So we're sending text messages to truck drivers. That's something that's a lot more complex. I would almost argue that it would be something like a 21, and we would want to break it down into a few different components. But thinking about these, we're all like relatively sizing. So even though I went in and changed the 5 and the 1s because actually meant those to be the opposite, like if we could make the argument that like the widget is the 1 and the text copy is the 5, that's our team agreement, and that's what we would go with moving forward. And we would retroactively kind of take a look back and see, was that correct when we move back and do our retrospectives. All right, so talking about methods of sizing. So there are a couple different ways that we can do sizing. There's t-shirt sizing. So t-shirt sizing works well for large bodies of work. And if we want to quickly go through a bunch of like features or large bodies in one small, like quick sitting. So like higher level chunks like epics. So we have buckets here. You can use buckets. You can use t-shirt sizes. They're all the same. We refer to them as small, medium, large, extra large. You could also add in extra small. Fibonacci. So standard Fibonacci is an industry standard for software development. So basically how you get to Fibonacci, and Austin kind of gave us the precursors, you add the previous number to get to the next number. So it goes up in larger increments as you go up on the scale. So one thing that I like about Fibonacci as a runner is that it almost helps you, it really actually does help you translate miles and kilometers. So if I'm running 13 kilometers, it's actually 8 miles. So I can just go 1 down on the scale. If I'm running a 5K is what we know as three-ish miles.
That's really cool, and I really wish I would have known that before now.
No, but I'm wondering if that's actually true or not.
Well, yeah, if you think about like a half marathon is 21 kilometers and it's about 13 miles. So it's like a really rough way to map out like miles and kilometers, which
That's
I find
so cool.
interesting. So, yeah.
What the heck? That's so crazy. It's
Yeah,
I think
it's
the
good
1
to-
point. I'm doing the math. 89 divided by 55. It's 1.61, which is it's 1.618, but it's very close.
Yeah. So life pro tip, if you need to do that, back of the napkin, math in real life, it has actual application. So it's kind of an easy way to think about it. And then you can also do modified Fibonacci, which is just similar to Fibonacci. That's actually, if we go back to Austin's mind is like blown right now.
Yeah.
If we go back to this, this one right here, this is actually the modified Fibonacci that I was referring to. So they have the 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, because it's easier to remember 21 instead of 30, or 20 instead of 21, and 40 instead of 34. Say goodbye to my dog. Any questions here on specific methods of sizing? Cool. So I think moving forward, we'll have this as a discussion question, but we'll probably use t-shirt sizing for bigger bodies of work like features and epics, and then one of these formats, Fibonacci, modified Fibonacci, for specific story sizing. Why don't we increment by a point? So single point increments are really specific, and we will get super tied up, I can guarantee you, arguing if a story is a 5 versus a 6 versus a 7, compared to a 3 versus a 5 versus an 8. So it basically just helps us make these quick decisions and move on, so we don't spin our wheels and argue about these things and spend, 2 hours doing our iteration planning meetings. All right, how do we facilitate pointing? This is specific to user stories. So keep that in mind when we talk about this, and not necessarily doing like larger feature and epic pointing, but we want to identify those base user stories. So the ones that we'll use as a reference when we're making our pointing moving forward. Then the PM, so Dane will bring up the story, discuss the requirements for the user story, and then we'll ask questions. So the engineers will start saying like, well, what about this dependency? Or what happens when we tap on this button? Or do we know if we need to save this information? So usually the asking questions part is typically like the longest part of this whole process, because we're getting clarification before we go into estimating. So then we estimate as a team. So we'll use some type of tool or framework to reach a consensus, and then validate. So after a session or at the end of a session, we'll go back and say, does this make sense? Does this story that we marked as an 8, is it actually an 8 now that we marked a couple other stories that are similar as like a 5 or a 3? So we'll just go back and we'll do a gut check at the end of every pointing session. And then in terms of who participates, so the PM usually will facilitate the pointing and not estimate, and the engineers and any QA, if you have them, will participate in the pointing. So anybody that's involved in the actual like development and testing of the story will do the pointing, and the rest of the folks will be observers or facilitators. So best practices when doing estimations: re-estimate a story if something's changed, or if for the first estimate you didn't reach a consensus, we'll just go back and we'll re-estimate after having a discussion. Use previous estimated user stories as a reference, an example to remember when or why we estimated something. So let's say we are creating some type of modal, and then 2 sprints later, we're doing another modal that's really similar. It will just help us to move along a lot faster if we know like, oh, that modal, we pointed a 3. Okay, cool. Do we all think it's a 3? And it will help things go faster when we're doing iteration planning. Remember that new teams won't get comfortable. It's going to be a little awkward, and these sessions might take a little bit longer in the beginning, and then we'll get the velocity kind of nailed down and we'll get a rhythm of pointing. But that will take probably a few iterations. And use effort estimations to help predict what stories will get completed this iteration and next iteration, and potentially weeks or even months out. So we can use these as predictions, like I said, but we don't necessarily want to use them as commitments. We don't want to estimate in time. We don't want to do this and say like 3 points equals 2 days or 1 point equals half a day. That's not what we want to do. We want to stick to the relative sizing. We won't consider our iteration estimates to be a commitment. They're just, what we think we can accomplish in an iteration. We won't compare our estimates to our other invisible teams' estimates, and we won't feel bad if our estimates are way off. Like we said, it's going to be a little rough in the beginning. I always like this meme too, because we always say that they're not deadlines, and then somehow it's sneaky, like, when is this going to get released? These things kind of like sneak in. So as a team, we need to commit to estimating the best that we can and not treating them as specific deadlines. When do we make them? Iteration planning meetings. When we plan out a roadmap, that's like the t-shirt sizing, the bigger epics and features. And if some information ever changes, then we should go back and repoint a story. And we'll do this through regular planning meetings to ensure that the backlog is well understood. So I left a few tools here. It sounds like from the right side, we'll be using linear. So got some clarification on that yesterday. So we'll be using that for backlog management and development management. It's up to us to pick a pointing tool. When I send this deck out, these links are interactive, so you'll be able to go here and play around. And I have set up a session on one of these for us to actually do our t-shirt sizing, so we'll be able to test it out. These tools are all very similar, so just pick one, and if you like it, great, keep using it. If you don't, then use a new one. They're typically free, and some of these workflow tools actually have estimation tools built in that you can use. A couple more slides here on bugs and velocity. So bugs are not estimatable. So we don't want to estimate them because we want them to show an impact on our velocity when we bring them in. So say we release some code, there's a bunch of bugs that we need to fix. And so we bring them into an iteration. We want to be able to identify that that has had an impact on our velocity, because we want to bring that up in our retrospective and say, wow, why was our velocity a little bit lower, or like half as much as we typically deliver? It was because there were a bunch of bugs that we had to work on. So we want that to show in our velocity and just be an indicator that, hey, there might be some things to discuss. Maybe there are missing requirements in user stories and we need that, or maybe there's something about this feature that's creating a bunch of bugs that we hadn't originally thought about. There might be edge cases. So we will not estimate bugs because we want them to show on our velocity. Speaking of, what is velocity? Velocity is a number that represents how many effort points a team completes in an iteration. So they're used to forecast and not commit to dates for development iterations and product releases. So they're basically a way to look back, and they're representative of completed stories only. So we'll look back on the previous X amount of iterations. We'll be able to see, cool, we delivered 25 points in that iteration, and then 26 in the next one, and 22 in the one after that. So we get a trend, and that will basically help us forecast, okay, everything's the same. Nobody's on holiday. Nobody's, taking a day off. And we'll be able to forecast. We think we'll then be able to probably get in around 25-ish points in the upcoming sprint. So it's just a good indicator to say, like, we know how much we can be planning for an iteration. So there, like I said, like pointing, it's unique to a development team, and it will fluctuate. There are holidays, there are things that pop up. We'll have new people come in, people leave. And so they're gonna fluctuate as the product fluctuates as well, and the team fluctuates. And if we have a bunch of roadblocks and we have absent teammates that are, somebody has the flu, then it will impact our velocity. So it's basically just some way for us to show progress and be able to plan our work a little bit better. They're not commitments. They're not correlated with time, cost, or iteration goals, and they're not transferable across different teams. And if we take away one thing from velocities, it's not used to measure a team's performance. It's just an indicator of what we can plan and what we have accomplished. All right, so let's talk about a framework that we would like to estimate in. And we already have this tool for tracking our user stories. We know that's going to be linear, so we don't have to spend a ton of time on that. Although once we do get access, we should spend some time getting familiar with it. Let's jump back to this slide here. So for pointing user stories, what framework do we feel comfortable moving forward with? Do we feel comfortable moving forward with Fibonacci? Do we want to move forward with modified Fibonacci, or does anybody have any other wild ideas for ways that they would like to point?
Modified.
Yeah, I like modified as well.
All right.